Hello. Tonight we settle in for a long, quiet look at one of history's greatest paradoxes, the 100 Years' War. Picture a green field in northern France, arrows still falling like rain, armored knights struggling in deep mud, and an English army smaller, tired, far from home somehow walking away victorious again. It happened at Crécy, at Poitiers, at Agincourt. England won the famous battles, one after another, yet in the end, after more than a century of fighting, England lost nearly everything it had gained on the continent. The French crown stayed French, and English kings gave up their old claim to it. How could a side that kept winning the big engagements still lose the war? So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you're listening right now, feel free to drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is there. It's always nice to know who's drifting off with these histories. Now, dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The 100 Years' War lasted, as the name suggests, for generations from 1337 until 1453. It was not one single continuous campaign, but a series of conflicts, truces, and renewed outbreaks. England and France clashed over land, trade, prestige, and above all, the right to the French throne itself. English armies crossed the Channel time and again, landed in Normandy or Gascony, marched inland, and more often than not defeated much larger French forces in open battle. Their longbowmen cut down waves of mounted knights. Their commanders showed remarkable tactical skill. At several moments it looked as though France might collapse entirely. Yet each time, the French found a way to endure. They avoided decisive battles when it suited them. They rebuilt armies. They taxed their people heavily but steadily. They waited for English commitment to fade, for money to run short, for politics back in London to pull troops home. And slowly, the balance shifted. By the middle of the 15th century, the English held only the port of Calais on the mainland. The dream of ruling both kingdoms from one throne was over. This is the central puzzle we'll follow tonight. Why battlefield triumphs did not add up to lasting victory. Wars are not decided only by who wins the dramatic clashes most people remember. They are decided by logistics, by money, by population, by alliances, by leadership that lasts beyond a single reign. England had brilliant soldiers and revolutionary weapons, but France had deeper resources and, in the end, a stronger sense of what it was fighting to protect. Historians still argue whether the war truly lasted exactly 116 years, or if it was really several separate wars strung together. Most agree, though, that it changed both countries forever. It helped turn England toward the sea and toward its own island identity. It forced France to build a stronger, more centralized kingdom, and it showed, long before modern strategists wrote it down, that winning battles is necessary but rarely sufficient on its own. One quirky detail often overlooked. During the long truces, English and French knights sometimes fought side by side in crusades or tournaments, almost as if the war was a family disagreement they could pause when something more entertaining came along. That easy mingling reminds us how intertwined the two nobilities were. Many English lords spoke French as their first language and owned lands across the Channel. Tonight we'll move calmly through the whole story, from the death of a French king with no son, to the rise of the Longbow, the horror of the Black Death, the capture of a French monarch, the madness of another, the brief miracle of Joan of Arc, and finally, the quiet reforms that ended English hopes. We'll watch victories turn hollow and defeats turn into slow recovery, and by the end, the paradox will feel less mysterious, though no less impressive. So settle back. The fire is low, the night is long, and the story is ready to begin. The year is 1328. In the royal palace at Vincennes, just outside Paris, King Charles IV of France lies dying. He is only 33 years old. He has reigned for 6 years, but now a fever takes hold, and the physicians can do little. More important than the illness itself is what it means for the kingdom. Charles has no son. His 2 previous marriages produced only daughters, and his 3rd wife, Jeanne d'Evreux, is pregnant, but no one yet knows the child's sex. On February 1, Charles IV breathes his last. The crown of France passes immediately into uncertainty. For 3 generations, the Capetian dynasty has produced male heirs without fail, one king smoothly following another. That direct line, stretching back over 300 years, now ends. A few weeks later, Queen Jeanne gives birth to a daughter. The baby lives only a short time, but even if she had survived, the question would remain: could a woman inherit the French throne? French custom has never allowed it. Lands and titles can pass through women, but the crown itself has always gone to a male. The old Frankish law, dug up and dusted off for the occasion, says clearly that women cannot rule France in their own right. So the search begins for the nearest male relative. Charles IV had 2 brothers who once wore the crown, Louis X and Philip V. Both are dead, but each left a daughter. There is also a sister, Isabella, still alive in England. Isabella is the only surviving child of King Philip IV, the formidable Philip the Fair. She is married to King Edward II of England, and together they have a son, Edward III, now 15 years old, strong, healthy, and very much male. From the English point of view, the claim looks straightforward. Edward III is the closest male descendant of Philip IV through his mother Isabella. If the crown can pass through a female line, then Edward should be King of France. French nobles, however, see it differently. They do not want a foreign king, especially one from England, sitting in Paris. They turn instead to a cousin, Philip of Valois, son of Charles of Valois, who was brother to Philip the Fair. Philip of Valois is 35, experienced, entirely French, and already in Paris when Charles IV dies. He has powerful friends among the great lords. On the 29th of May, 1328, in Reims Cathedral, Philip is crowned as Philip VI. The ceremony goes ahead quickly, before any English protest can arrive. Edward III, still a teenager under his mother's influence, sends ambassadors to protest. They argue that the crown belongs to him by right. Philip VI listens politely and then refuses. He points to the long tradition that excludes women from the succession. The French assembly of nobles backs him fully. They are not prepared to accept an English boy as their king. This rejection plants the seed of war. Edward III does not forget the slight. In 1330, he takes full control of his own kingdom after deposing his mother and her allies. He is ambitious, skilled in arms, and surrounded by lords who remember the rich lands their families once held in France. Gascony, in the southwest, still belongs to the English crown, but as a fief held from the French king. Every few years, disputes flare up over homage and jurisdiction. By 1337, tensions have built steadily. Philip VI threatens to confiscate Gascony if Edward does not come in person to pay homage as a vassal. Edward refuses. Instead, he revives the old claim. In a formal letter, he declares himself the rightful King of France. Philip responds by declaring Gascony forfeit. Armies begin to gather. Historians still argue whether Edward truly believed he could win the French crown or simply used the claim as a powerful bargaining tool. Most lean toward the second view. The title gave him leverage to protect English lands and trade interests. Either way, the dynastic crisis of 1328 provided the spark. One lesser-known detail adds a touch of irony. When Philip VI was crowned, the sacred oil used for French kings, the holy ampulla, said to have been brought by a dove for Clovis, supposedly ran low. Courtiers whispered that it was a bad omen. Whether true or not, the story spread quietly among those uneasy about the new king. The crisis also revealed how closely the two royal families were linked. Cousins, uncles, in-laws, they shared blood and history. Yet that very closeness made the rivalry sharper. Neither side could easily back down without losing face. And so, because one king died without a son, and because French lords chose a cousin over a nephew across the Channel, the stage was set for generations of conflict. The 100 Years' War did not begin with a grand declaration or a single battle. It began here, in quiet palace rooms and hurried coronations, over a question of who should wear the fleur-de-lis crown. To understand why the dynastic crisis of 1328 turned into open war, we need to step further back. The roots of the 100 Years' War lie in a much older story of marriage, inheritance, and overlapping kingdoms. It begins in the 12th century, when an English king ruled more land in France than the French king himself. In 1152, a young woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine divorced her first husband, King Louis VII of France. Just 8 weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, soon to become Henry II of England. Eleanor brought with her an enormous dowry, the vast duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest, stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees. Henry already held Normandy and Anjou from his parents. When he took the English crown in 1154, the result was a sprawling domain that historians call the Angevin Empire. On a map, it looked impressive. The English king controlled England, of course, plus Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine, roughly half of modern France. The French king, based in Paris, held a much smaller area around the Ile-de-France. In theory, the English king was the French king's vassal for those continental lands. He had to swear homage, promise loyalty, and provide military service when called. In practice, Henry II was far more powerful than his overlord. This arrangement worked, uneasily, for a while. Henry II and his sons Richard the Lionheart and John spent more time on the continent than in England. They built castles, collected taxes, and fought local rebels. But the French kings never accepted the imbalance. They worked patiently to chip away at Plantagenet power. The turning point came during the reign of King John. In 1204, after a series of legal disputes and military campaigns, the French king Philip II seized Normandy, Anjou, and most of the northern lands. John lost them in a matter of months. From that moment on, the English crown kept only the reduced duchy of Aquitaine, now usually called Gascony, and a few surrounding counties. The Angevin Empire shrank dramatically. Gascony mattered greatly to England. It produced wine that English merchants shipped north in huge quantities. Bordeaux became almost an English city in feeling. English kings appointed seneschals there, collected customs duties, and defended the region against local lords. But legally, Gascony remained a fief held from the French crown. Every new English king had to travel to Paris, or send representatives to perform homage for it. This vassal status created constant friction. French kings could summon the Duke of Gascony, meaning the English king, to appear in French courts over local disputes. If he refused, they could declare the land forfeit. English kings, in turn, resented answering to a rival monarch. They delayed homage, appealed cases to their own courts, and sheltered rebels who fled from French justice. Over the 13th century, the pattern repeated itself. A new king in England or France would try to smooth relations. Homage would be performed, sometimes grudgingly. Trade would flow again. Then a border incident, a disputed inheritance, or an appeal from a Gascon lord would spark fresh arguments. Armies would gather, raids would cross borders, but full-scale war stayed limited. One quirky detail stands out from these years. English kings kept the title Duke of Aquitaine long after they lost control of most of the old duchy. They used it on official documents and coins. French kings, meanwhile, granted the same title to their own sons. Both sides claimed the same land on paper, even when one clearly held it on the ground. Historians still argue whether the loss of Normandy in 1204 was the true beginning of lasting hostility. Some say the wound never healed. English nobles kept family ties and memories across the Channel. Others point out that trade continued peacefully for long stretches, suggesting practical cooperation beneath the rivalry. By the early 14th century, the situation had grown more tense. Edward I and Edward II both fought short campaigns in Gascony to protect it. French kings built new fortresses along the border. Flemish allies important for England's wool trade pulled the two crowns into wider disputes. Scotland added another layer. French kings supported Scottish independence to keep England busy on its northern border. When Charles IV died in 1328, these old tensions waited just below the surface. The claim Edward III made to the French throne was new, but the underlying problem was centuries old. An English king still held land in France as a vassal. He still owed homage he hated giving. French kings still wanted to absorb that last remaining piece, or at least reduce its independence. The roots, then, ran deep. Marriage had once joined vast territories to the English crown. Defeat had taken most away, but left enough to keep the connection alive and painful. Gascony became the constant reminder that the two kingdoms could never fully separate. Every shipment of wine from Bordeaux carried not just profit, but politics. In the decades before 1337, both sides tested the limits. Appeals, confiscations, arrests of merchants, all built pressure. When Philip VI finally moved to seize Gascony outright, Edward III had his justification. The war that followed was not just about a dead king's succession, it was the long-delayed explosion of a relationship doomed from the start. One king as another's vassal, yet refusing to accept the role. The dynastic claim and the old feud over Gascony gave Edward III his reasons for war, but deeper forces drove both sides forward. Money and alliances turned a family dispute into a broader conflict. Two areas stood out: the wealthy county of Flanders in the north, and the Kingdom of Scotland across England's border. Flanders mattered because of wool. English sheep produced the finest fleece in Europe, long, strong fibres perfect for high-quality cloth. Flemish towns like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres had thousands of weavers who turned that raw wool into expensive fabric sold across the continent. English merchants shipped huge quantities every year. The customs duties on wool exports filled Edward III's treasury. In good years, wool paid for half the royal budget. Flemish cities, though, were technically part of the Kingdom of France. Their counts owed allegiance to the French king. When relations between England and France grew tense, Philip VI could pressure the Count to block English wool or arrest English merchants. The weavers hated that. Without steady English supplies, looms stood idle and workers went hungry. In the 1330s, Flemish towns rebelled repeatedly against their pro-French Count. Leaders like Jacob van Artevelde in Ghent looked to England for protection. Edward III saw the opportunity. He offered trade guarantees and military support in exchange for loyalty. In 1340, he even travelled to Flanders in person and proclaimed himself King of France there, surrounded by cheering burghers. The alliance gave him a foothold on the continent outside Gascony. Flemish militia fought alongside English armies in early campaigns. Wool kept flowing, and Edward's war chest stayed full. This economic link made the war bigger than a royal inheritance fight. Cutting off wool hurt France's own subjects while funding England's invasions. Philip VI tried countermeasures inviting Scottish wool, promoting cloth making inside France, but nothing matched England's supply. The trade became a quiet engine behind the louder battles. Further north, Scotland played a different but equally important role. Ever since William Wallace and Robert the Bruce won independence at Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish kings looked to France for help against England. The alliance, later called the Auld Alliance, began in the 1290s and grew stronger over time. French kings sent money, weapons, and sometimes troops to Scotland. In return, Scotland kept English forces tied down at home. For Edward III, this second front was a constant worry. If he sent his full army to France, Scotland might raid across the border or even invade. He had to leave strong garrisons in northern castles and maintain fleets to watch the eastern coast. Early in the war, Scottish armies did exactly that, attacking while English troops were overseas. David II, King of Scots, coordinated with Philip VI whenever possible. The pattern became familiar. When England pressed hard in France, France pressed hard in Scotland. Resources stretched thin on both sides. Edward III won a major victory against the Scots at Neville's Cross in 1346 and captured David II. But holding the king ransom did not end the threat. Scottish lords continued guerrilla raids for decades. Historians still argue whether the Scottish front truly changed the war's outcome or simply made it longer and costlier. Most agree it forced England to fight with one hand tied. Armies raised for France often had to turn back north. Taxes raised for continental campaigns paid instead for border defences. One quirky detail from these years involves the wool trade itself. English merchants developed a clever system called the staple, a single port, usually Calais after it was captured, where all wool exports had to pass. This controlled quality, collected taxes efficiently, and kept merchants under royal watch. Flemish buyers grumbled about the monopoly, but they kept coming. These economic and alliance threads wove tightly into the larger conflict. Flanders gave England money and men. Scotland gave France distraction and pressure. Neither was part of the original succession dispute, yet both shaped how the war unfolded. By 1337, when Edward III formally challenged Philip VI, these pieces were already in place. He embargoed wool to Flanders to force the cities into open support. Philip responded by welcoming Scottish envoys and preparing to aid them. The war that began as a claim to a throne quickly became a struggle over trade routes and border security. Gascony remained the spark, the Dynastic claimed the banner, but wool paid the soldiers and Scotland pinned down reserves. Without those underlying forces, Edward might have settled for negotiation. With them, full war became almost inevitable. The coming campaigns would show how these quiet economic ties and distant alliances turned scattered raids into a generations-long contest. England had the wealth from wool and the early support of Flemish towns. France had the deeper population and the steady help from Scotland. Both sides believed their advantages would prove decisive. As we will see, the balance shifted many times. The war began not on land, but at sea. In the spring of 1337, Edward III declared himself King of France and placed an embargo on wool exports. Philip VI answered by confiscating Gascony and preparing a fleet. French ships gathered in the harbours of Normandy, joined by hired Genoese galleys. Their plan was simple: raid the English coast, disrupt trade, and perhaps land troops to support Scotland. Edward could not allow that. Control of the Channel meant everything. Supplies for any invasion of France had to cross it. Wool money had to cross it. If French ships dominated the narrow waters, the war would end before it properly started. Edward acted quickly. He raised funds from Parliament, borrowed from Flemish merchants, and ordered every port to ready ships. By early summer 1340, an English fleet of about 200 vessels, mostly requisitioned merchant cogs, sailed from Orwell in Suffolk. On June 24, they reached the port of Sluis, at the mouth of the Zween estuary in Flanders. There lay the French fleet, packed tightly in the harbour. Estimates vary, but the French and their allies had around 200 ships as well, including large warships and the sleek Genoese galleys rowed by professional crews. Many French vessels were chained together for defence, forming a floating barrier across the water. Edward's commanders studied the situation. The tide was rising. Wind favoured the English approach. They decided to attack at once. The fleet formed into 3 divisions. Longbowmen and men-at-arms crowded the decks and high wooden castles built fore and aft on the cogs. Trumpets sounded, and the English ships bore down. The battle began in the late afternoon. English archers opened fire from range. Arrows poured onto the crowded French decks. French crossbowmen, especially the Genoese, returned fire, but their weapons reloaded slowly and lost power in the damp air. English longbows shot faster and farther. Soon the advantage shifted. Boarding actions followed. English sailors grappled enemy ships and swarmed aboard. Fighting was close, and brutal swords, axes, daggers in the narrow spaces between masts. The chained French ships could not maneuver. One by one, they fell. Some French crews cut their cables and tried to flee upriver, only to run aground as the tide fell. By nightfall, the outcome was clear. Dozens of French ships were captured or sunk. The Genoese admiral fled with a handful of galleys. Casualty figures are uncertain, but French losses were heavy, perhaps 16,000 men killed or drowned. Many of them non-combatants pressed into service. English losses were far lighter. Edward himself fought in the thick of it. He took an arrow wound to the thigh but stayed on deck. The victory gave him lasting fame at home. Chroniclers described the harbour choked with bodies and wrecked hulls. For years afterward, fishermen pulled up armour and bones in their nets. Control of the sea now belonged to England. French raiding plans collapsed. Flemish towns, already leaning toward Edward, welcomed his protection more warmly. Safe passage across the Channel allowed English armies to land where they chose in the coming years. Historians still argue whether Sluis was truly decisive or simply a strong opening move. Most agree it removed an immediate threat and boosted morale. Edward returned home to raise more funds, confident that his supply lines would stay open. One quirky detail survives in the records. Among the captured French ships was a vessel named the Christopher, once an English ship taken earlier by the French. Edward's men recognized it immediately and reclaimed it with satisfaction. Small moments like that reminded everyone how personal the war could feel. The victory at Sluis did not end naval danger forever. France rebuilt fleets over time, and later campaigns saw fierce sea fights again. But for the first decade of the war, England held the upper hand on water. Troops crossed safely for the Crécy campaign in 1346. Reinforcements reached Guesclin without major loss. Philip VI never managed a serious invasion of England. His admirals grew cautious. Coastal towns in southern England slept more easily. The battle also showed early signs of English tactical thinking, using merchant ships effectively, relying on archery even at sea, coordinating large fleets. Edward used the triumph well. He toured Flanders, met Van Artevelde, and strengthened alliances. Money flowed in. Parliament granted taxes for further campaigns. The naval win bought time and space for the land war to develop. As the years passed, memory of Sluis faded beside the great field battles. Yet without it, those battles might never have happened. An army that cannot reach the field cannot win on it. The quiet dominance of the Channel in the 1340s and 1350s rested on those hours of fighting off the Flemish coast. The war moved inland next. Edward prepared a major expedition, aiming for northern France itself. With the sea secure, he could choose his landing and march where he wished. The momentum gained at Sluis carried forward, setting the stage for the Longbow triumphs to come. With the Channel secure after Sluis, Edward III prepared a major land campaign. In July 1346, he sailed with an army of about 12,000 men, half archers, half men-at-arms, and landed unopposed in Normandy. His plan was to raid deep into French territory, draw Philip VI into battle, and force a decisive encounter. The English moved fast, burning towns and villages as they went. They sacked Caen, then marched north toward Flanders. Philip gathered a much larger force. Estimates range from 20,000 to 40,000, including thousands of heavily armoured knights and hired Genoese crossbowmen. He pursued the English, determined to trap them before they could escape across the Somme River. For days, the French pressed close, but Edward's men stayed just ahead. On August 26, near the village of Crécy en Poitiers, Edward chose his ground. He positioned his army on a gentle ridge with open fields in front. The right flank rested on the village, the left on woods. He divided his force into 3 battles, or divisions. The vanguard, led by his 16-year-old son Edward the Black Prince, held the forward slope. 2 larger groups waited behind. Wagons formed a makeshift park for supplies. Most important were the archers. Edward placed them in wedge formations between the blocks of dismounted knights. Thousands of longbowmen, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000, stood ready with yew bows 6 feet tall and arrows a yard long. Each man carried 2 sheaves, 48 arrows total. They drove stakes into the ground for protection against cavalry. Philip's army arrived late in the afternoon, tired from a long march. Scouts reported the English position strong, and some French commanders urged delay until morning. Philip agreed at first, but the forward units pressed on anyway. Discipline broke down. Knights eager for glory pushed past each other to reach the front. The battle opened around sunset. Philip sent his Genoese crossbowmen forward to soften the English line. About 6,000 mercenaries advanced, shields raised, cranking their weapons. But a sudden rain shower earlier had wet their bowstrings. Pavis's heavy shields had fallen behind in the baggage train. When they loosed their first volley, the bolts fell short. English longbowmen answered at once. Shooting in high arcs, they sent wave after wave of arrows into the crowded Genoese, draw weights reached over 100 pounds. Arrows punched through mail and armor at close range. The Genoese could fire only 2 or 3 bolts per minute. English archers managed 10 or 12. Within minutes, the mercenaries wavered, then turned and fled through their own advancing knights. Chaos followed. French knights, already moving forward, trampled the retreating crossbowmen. Philip reportedly shouted for them to stop, but no one could hold the surge. Wave after wave of mounted men charged up the slope. The ground rose gently, slowing their pace. Horses bunched together in the narrow space between woods and village. Each charge met the same storm of arrows. Bodkin points pierced plate armor at the joints. Horses fell screaming, throwing riders. Dismounted knights struggled uphill in heavy gear. English men-at-arms waited behind their stakes, ready to finish any who reached the line. 15 or 16 charges came that evening and into the night. Lanterns and torches lit the field as fighting continued. The Black Prince's division bore the heaviest attacks, but held firm. At one point, messengers asked Edward for help. He replied, "Let the boy win his spurs." The prince did. By dawn, the field lay covered with dead. French losses were staggering thousands of knights, including the King of Bohemia, the Count of Alençon, and many great lords. Philip himself escaped wounded. English casualties numbered in the low hundreds. Crécy changed warfare. It proved that disciplined infantry, especially massed archers, could defeat traditional heavy cavalry. French chivalry relied on shock and prestige. The charge was meant to break morale. At Crécy, terrain, preparation, and volume of fire turned that charge into slaughter. Historians still argue whether the longbow alone decided the day or if French disorganization mattered more. Most agree the combination was lethal. English training from childhood produced archers who could loose accurately under pressure. Constant practice was required by law in England. One quirky detail often mentioned. The blind King John of Bohemia asked his knights to lead him into the fight so he could strike a blow. They tied their reins to his and charged together. All were killed. His ostrich plume crest was taken by the Black Prince, who later adopted the motto, Ich dien. The victory opened northern France to English raiding. Edward marched to Calais and laid siege. The port would fall after 11 months, giving England a permanent bridgehead. Crécy's lessons spread slowly. French commanders remained committed to nightly charges for years, but doubt had entered. Longbowmen became the backbone of English armies for a century. Recruited from villages and paid wages, they were professionals, not feudal levies. Their weapon was simple but demanded skill. Yew staves imported from Italy or Spain, fletched with goose feathers, strung with hemp. Crécy showed the shift beginning across Europe, from feudal hosts to paid, specialized forces. It also marked the high point of early English success. Philip VI's prestige suffered badly. Taxes rose to rebuild armies. Yet France endured, its greater population and resources waiting for the right moment. The battle's echo carried far. Future commanders studied the ground at Crécy, the value of position, the danger of uncoordinated attacks. For now, Edward returned home a hero. Parliament voted funds gladly. The war had its first great English triumph, and the longbow its defining moment. The guns fell silent after Crécy and the fall of Calais in 1347. Both sides were exhausted. Edward III returned to England with glory and a new port. Philip VI struggled to pay his debts. A truce settled over the land, meant to last years. Negotiators met, discussed ransom for prisoners, and argued over borders. no one expected what came next. In the autumn of 1347, ships from the Black Sea docked at Messina in Sicily. Rats in their holds carried fleas, and those fleas carried a bacterium no one understood. Within weeks, people began to die: fever, swollen lymph nodes, dark patches on the skin. The sickness spread from port to port, town to town. By early 1348, it reached southern France. By summer, it swept across the whole continent. The Black Death, as it became known, killed quickly and without mercy. In cities, half the population vanished in months. In some villages, almost everyone died. Estimates suggest that Europe lost between 30 and 50% of its people between 1347 and 1351. England and France suffered equally. Paris emptied, London's streets filled with carts collecting bodies. Priests died faster than they could bury the dead. Armies could not fight when plague raged. Recruitment stopped. Soldiers already under arms fell ill in camps. The long siege of Calais had just ended when the wave hit. Many veterans carried the disease home. Truces extended naturally. No king could raise a proper host. Even bandits paused their raids. When the first horror passed around 1351, the world had changed. Fewer workers meant higher wages for those who survived. Peasants demanded better terms from lords. In England, the government tried to freeze wages at old levels, sparking resentment. In France, heavy taxes to fund the war now fell on far fewer shoulders. Both kingdoms faced unrest. Militarily, the plague reshaped everything. Armies had always depended on large numbers of foot soldiers drawn from the countryside. With population halved, kings could no longer summon the same feudal levies. Professional troops paid archers. Men-at-arms under contract became more common. Campaigns grew smaller, more careful. Raiding replaced big invasions, because neither side could replace heavy losses easily. The English held an edge here. Their system already relied on paid, indented companies. Groups of soldiers contracted for set periods. Longbowmen were skilled specialists, not easy to replace, but England's smaller population recovered faster in some regions. France, with more land and people before the plague, lost more in raw numbers. Rebuilding took longer. Tax collection suffered everywhere. Fewer taxpayers meant less money for war. Edward III had borrowed heavily for the Crécy campaign. Now lenders grew cautious. Philip VI's successors faced constant shortages. Ransom payments for noble prisoners, huge sums after Crécy and Poitiers, strained treasuries further. Historians still argue whether the Black Death prolonged the war or shortened it. Some say it gave France breathing room to reform. Others point out that England's victories in the 1350s came partly because French society was still disrupted. Most agree the plague shifted the balance towards smaller, more mobile forces and away from massive nightly hosts. One quirky detail lingers from the records. In 1349, Edward III ordered public prayers and processions to ward off the disease. At the same time, he banned football and other games, claiming they distracted people from archery practice and penance. The law failed, people kept playing, but it shows how leaders grasped for control in chaos. The plague also changed attitudes. Survivors often felt a new urgency. Life seemed shorter, more fragile. Some nobles spent freely on tournaments and luxury. Others turned to religion, founding chapels or joining orders. Chroniclers wrote of comets and earthquakes as signs of divine anger over the war itself. By the mid-1350s, fighting resumed slowly. Small companies, English ones especially, raided across France. They lived off the land, avoiding big battles. French countryside, already thinned by death, suffered more. Empty villages dotted the landscape. Fields returned to brush. The war became a grinding contest of endurance. The Black Death did not choose sides. It struck Calais garrison and Bordeaux merchants alike. Yet its aftermath favoured those who adapted quickest. England's island position helped limit later outbreaks. Trade recovered sooner. Wool exports, though reduced, brought steady income. France faced deeper scars. Royal authority weakened as local lords filled the vacuum. Bandits, called routiers, roamed freely, many of them unemployed soldiers from both armies. Clearing them took years. When the next great campaign came in 1355, 1356, armies were smaller than before Crécy. Tactics leaned even more on archery and mobility. The plague had cleared the board, removing millions and leaving the survivors to fight over a poorer, emptier land. The disease returned in waves 1361, 1369, and beyond, each time taking fewer lives as immunity grew. But the first blow reshaped Europe permanently. Population would not reach pre-plague levels for centuries. The war continued in this new reality. Fewer men, higher costs, longer recovery. The truce after Calais lasted, in name, until 1355. In truth, the plague enforced the longest pause of the entire conflict. When swords were drawn again, both kingdoms were changed leaner, harder, and more aware that nature itself could intervene more terribly than any battle. The truce held through the early 1350s, but only on paper. Small companies of English and Gascon soldiers roamed central France, living off the land. They took castles, collected ransoms, and avoided large French forces. The French called these raids chevauchées, burning paths meant to weaken royal authority. Edward III's eldest son, the Black Prince, led one of the biggest in 1355, marching from Bordeaux to the Mediterranean and back. In 1356, the Black Prince set out again with about 8,000 men, archers, men-at-arms, and Gascon allies. His aim was another destructive raid through French territory. King John II, who had succeeded Philip VI in 1350, finally had an army ready. He gathered perhaps 20,000 men and moved south to intercept the English before they could return to safety. The two forces manoeuvred for days near Poitiers. The Black Prince tried to slip away southeast, but French scouts blocked the roads. Food ran low in the English camp. On September 18, negotiators met under a truce flag. Cardinals offered terms. The prince would return captured towns and promise 7 years of peace. He considered accepting, but his men urged fight. Talks broke down. The next morning, September 19, the Black Prince positioned his army on a low ridge covered with vines and hedges. A narrow lane ran between thickets, limiting French approach. He dismounted most knights, placed archers on the flanks, and kept a small mounted reserve hidden. Wagons formed a barrier for the baggage. John II divided his force into 4 battles. He ordered many knights to fight on foot, hoping to copy English tactics. Thousands of others stayed mounted for flanking moves. The plan looked sound on paper. The battle began mid-morning. French foot knights advanced steadily up the slope, shields locked. English arrows met them, thinning ranks but not stopping the push. The lead division, under the Duke of Orléans, reached the English line and fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted. For a time, the French held ground. Then confusion spread. The The Duke of Orleans' division withdrew, some say in panic, others to regroup. The next wave pressed forward anyway. Meanwhile, French mounted knights tried a wide sweep around the English left. Archers on the flank turned and poured flanking fire into the chargers. Horses fell in heaps. Riders dismounted and joined the press on foot. The Black Prince sent his small reserve, perhaps 400 mounted men, around the other flank under Captal de Buch. They struck the French rear just as the main attack faltered. Panic rippled through the crowded French ranks. Men began to flee. King John and his youngest son Philip stood in the centre with a small guard, fighting stubbornly. English soldiers closed in. Archers ran out of arrows and joined with knives and hammers. One by one, French nobles surrendered to claim ransom. John II defended himself bravely, but numbers overwhelmed his group. A knight from Artois, fighting for England, claimed the king's surrender. John handed over his gauntlet, the accepted sign. By late afternoon, the field belonged to the English. French losses were enormous, thousands killed or captured, including much of the high nobility. The Black Prince treated his royal prisoner with respect. They dined together that evening, the prince serving the king. The victory stunned Europe. An English army half the size had destroyed the main French host. John II, called John the Good, rode north in English custody. His son Philip, only 14, had stayed at his side throughout, earning the nickname Philip the Bold. France teetered on collapse. With the king captive, government fell to the Dauphin Charles, a young man in Paris. Nobles argued over policy. Cities demanded reforms. Bands of unemployed soldiers roamed the countryside. In 1358, a peasant uprising called the Jacquerie erupted in the north, brutally suppressed but revealing deep unrest. The Black Prince brought John to London in 1357. Crowds lined the streets to see the French king ride in procession. Negotiations began for ransom, 4 million gold crowns, an impossible sum. In exchange, Edward III demanded huge territorial concessions, most of southwest France and more. A preliminary treaty at London in 1359 gave Edward almost everything he wanted, but French leaders rejected it. Edward landed again that year with a fresh army and marched on Reims to be crowned King of France. The city held. He turned toward Paris, but storms and shortages forced retreat. Historians still argue whether Poitiers marked the closest England ever came to total victory. Most agree that capturing the king paralyzed France for years. Royal authority crumbled. Taxes could not be collected effectively. One quirky detail stands out. During the battle, King John carried a small baton as his command symbol. When surrounded, he reportedly struck out with it until overwhelmed. The baton survives today in a museum, a simple piece of wood from a day that changed kingdoms. The war shifted after Poitiers. Large battles grew rare. English companies held castles and collected tribute. France struggled to pay even part of the ransom. John II, honor-bound, returned briefly to captivity in 1364 when a hostage son escaped. For now, England stood at its strongest. The Black Prince's reputation soared. Calais, Gascony, and much in between flew English banners. Yet, the underlying problems remained. Holding distant lands cost money, and English commitment could waver. France, broken as it seemed, still had depth. Recovery would come, slowly and painfully. The capture of a king bought England years of advantage, but not the war itself. France stood at its lowest point after Poitiers. King John II remained a prisoner in England. Vast territories in the southwest and north flew English banners under the harsh terms of ongoing treaties. Unemployed soldiers from both sides formed roaming companies that plundered the countryside. The Dauphin Charles, barely 20, ruled from Paris amid factional strife and empty treasuries. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny finally secured John's release. Edward III gained huge lands, outright no homage required, including expanded Gascony, Poitou, and Calais. In return, he promised to renounce his claim to the French throne. John returned home, but the ransom payments quickly fell behind. France groaned under new taxes. When John could not meet guarantees, he voluntarily went back to captivity in London, where he died in 1364. The Dauphin became King Charles V. He was no warrior like his grandfather Philip VI or his father. Physically frail, scholarly, and cautious, he preferred books and counsel to armor. Yet he proved one of France's most effective rulers. He understood that repeating Crécy and Poitiers would only bring more disasters. French knights could not match English archery in open battle. Charles chose a different path. His strategy was simple but demanding: refuse decisive engagements, rebuild finances, recover lost ground inch by inch. He raised steady taxes with the help of reformed assemblies called the Estates General. He strengthened royal administration, appointing loyal officials to collect revenue directly. Money flowed again, enough to hire professional companies and maintain fortresses. Most important, Charles found the right commander, Bertrand du Guesclin, a tough Breton knight of modest birth. Short, dark, and plain-spoken, du Guesclin had no taste for grand charges. He excelled at ambushes, sieges, and small actions. Charles made him Constable of France in 1370, the highest military office. Du Guesclin's orders were clear: avoid battle unless victory was certain. Harass English garrisons, cut supply lines, retake castles one by one. He recruited Routier's former bandits into royal pay, turning predators into disciplined troops. When English forces marched deep into France, he shadowed them, burning crops ahead and blocking wells. Armies need food. Without it, they withdraw. The turnaround began slowly. In the late 1360s, Gascon lords unhappy with English rule appealed to Charles. French troops moved in quietly, accepting surrenders from towns tired of heavy English taxes. Du Guesclin won small victories, surprising English columns, capturing outposts. Each success encouraged more defections. The Black Prince, now ruling the expanded Aquitaine from Bordeaux, tried to restore control. Heavy taxation to fund his court sparked revolt. In 1369, Charles formally resumed the war, declaring the Bretigny terms broken. English lands became fair targets again. The Black Prince led a chevauchée north in response, but illness, likely dysentery, slowed him. Du Guesclin refused battle. The raid achieved little. By 1372, the prince returned to England, never to fight again. He died in 1376. At sea, French fortunes improved too. Castilian galleys, allied through clever diplomacy, defeated an English fleet off La Rochelle in 1372. Supply lines to Gascony weakened. Town after town fell to French sieges. Du Guesclin's masterpiece came in the mid-1370s. He methodically cleared Poitou, Saintonge, and much of the southwest. English commanders, outnumbered locally and stretched thin, could not be everywhere. When they concentrated, Du Guesclin withdrew. When they dispersed, he struck. By 1375, England held only Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Calais on the continent. The gains of Bretigny had almost vanished. A truce at Bruges that year paused major fighting, but France had regained the initiative. Historians still argue whether Charles V's strategy was truly original or simply common sense after repeated defeats. Most agree it suited France's strengths: greater population, more castles, shorter interior lines. England could win battles but struggled to garrison vast areas far from home. One quirky detail survives in chronicles. Du Guesclin disliked fancy armour. He fought in plain gear, often on foot among his men. Captured multiple times early in his career, he always paid his own ransom promptly, earning respect even from enemies. Charles V also reformed the army itself. He created standing companies paid directly by the crown, reducing reliance on unreliable feudal levies. He encouraged artillery development, early cannons to batter walls. Discipline improved. Looting was punished. The king's health failed by the late 1370s. He died in 1380 at 43, leaving a 12-year-old son, Charles VI. Du Guesclin followed soon after, worn out by constant campaigning. Their work, however, endured. France had learned patience. The shift to attrition warfare, called the Fabian strategy, after an ancient Roman general, marked a turning point. England's battlefield brilliance no longer sufficed. Holding territory required permanent presence, and Parliament grew tired of endless expense. For the first time since 1346, France dictated the pace. Lost provinces returned without great battles. Royal authority strengthened in recovered areas. The memory of Crécy and Poitiers faded against steady gains. The resurgence was not complete. Truces came and went. English raids still stung, yet the worst crisis had passed. Charles V and Du Guesclin showed that refusing to lose could, over time, amount to winning. The war entered a new phase, one of endurance rather than glory. Charles V died in September 1380, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Charles VI. Regents ruled in the boy's name, his uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, and Burgundy. They quickly reversed many of the late king's careful reforms. Taxes rose again for personal gain. Du Guesclin's disciplined companies were disbanded to save money. English garrisons in Bordeaux and Calais watched quietly as French strength slipped. Young Charles grew into a handsome, athletic king. He took personal rule in 1388 at age 20 and started well, recalling his father's advisors and lowering taxes. Peace held under extended truces. Both sides were weary. Trade recovered. For a few years, it seemed the long war might fade into diplomacy. Then, in August 1392, disaster struck. During a campaign against Brittany, Charles rode through a forest on a hot day. A page accidentally dropped a lance. The clang startled the king. Suddenly, Charles drew his sword and attacked his own escort, killing several knights before being subdued. When he recovered, he remembered nothing. Doctors called it fever from the heat, but the episodes returned. By the late 1390s, Charles suffered long periods of madness. At times he believed he was made of glass and feared shattering if touched. At others he forgot his own name, his wife, his children. He wandered palace halls unclean, refusing baths or fresh clothes. Lucid months came and went, but never lasted. With the king incapacitated, power fell to the royal uncles and other great lords. Two factions emerged. The Orléans party, led by the king's brother Louis of Orléans, favoured continuing the war against England when possible and drew support from the south. The Burgundian party, led by Duke Philip the Bold and later his son John the Fearless, controlled Paris and the north. They leaned toward peace with England to protect Flemish trade. rivalry turned deadly. In 1407, John the Fearless ordered the assassination of Louis of Orléans on a Paris street. Armed men struck him down at night. John admitted responsibility but claimed justification. Civil war erupted between the factions. Armagnacs, supporters of Orléans' son, against Burgundians. France fractured. Armagnacs held the king when lucid. Burgundians seized Paris and the royal family when they could. Taxes went unpaid. Soldiers deserted or turned bandit. English companies, still holding Calais and Gascony, began probing raids again. In 1413, Henry V became King of England. Young, energetic, and pious, he saw opportunity in French chaos. He revived the old claim to the throne, demanding the full terms of Bretigny plus Normandy and more. Negotiations at Winchester failed. In 1415, Henry sailed with a fresh army of about 10,000 men. French leaders tried to unite. A large army gathered, but factional mistrust lingered. Command was shared uneasily. Henry besieged Harfleur, took it after a hard fight, then marched toward Calais. The French intercepted him near Agincourt. The great schism in the church added another layer of disorder. Since 1378, 2 popes claimed authority, one in Rome, one in Avignon. France supported Avignon, England supported Rome. Kings used the split to control church appointments and income. During Charles VI's madness, rival popes issued conflicting orders, deepening confusion. Historians still argue whether Charles's illness was schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or porphyria. Records describe alternating mania and depression, delusions, and neglect of hygiene. Modern scholars lean toward a hereditary condition, possibly passed from his mother. One quirky detail from palace accounts. During sane periods, Charles loved extravagant parties. He and his courtiers once dressed as wild men in flammable costumes. A spark set them alight. The king survived only because a duchess smothered the flames with her train. The Bal des Ardents in 1393 shocked the court and fueled whispers of divine judgment. The internal chaos gave England its opening. While Armagnacs and Burgundians fought each other, English forces moved freely. Henry V's 1,415 campaign succeeded beyond expectation. After Agincourt, he returned twice more, conquering Normandy systematically. Burgundians, fearing Armagnac dominance, even negotiated separately with Henry. In 1419, a meeting on the bridge at Montereau turned violent. Armagnacs murdered John the Fearless. His son, Philip the Good, allied openly with England in revenge. By 1420, France had 3 powers: the Mad King and his court, controlled by the Dauphin Charles, the Burgundian territories in the north and east, and growing English holdings in the northwest. The Treaty of Troyes that year would formalize the division. The years of Charles VI's reign, 1380 to 1422, saw France's deepest collapse. Royal authority vanished outside a few strongholds. Cities paid protection to whoever held local power. Peasants suffered worst, caught between armies and bandits. England could not have asked for better conditions. Henry V exploited the divisions masterfully. Yet the very chaos that invited return also limited lasting conquest. Factions shifted. Alliances broke. Loyalty bought today might vanish tomorrow. Charles VI lived on, lucid rarely, dying in October 1422 at 53. His reign began with hope after Charles V's recovery and ended with the kingdom carved up. The madness of one man helped reopen a war many thought fading. France's internal wounds proved deeper than any battlefield defeat. The stage was set for England's last great push and for the unexpected force that would reverse it all. Henry V landed at Harfleur in August 1415 with about 10,000 men. His plan was straightforward: seize the port as a new base, then march to Calais and home, showing strength along the way. Harfleur fell after a 5-week siege, but disease struck the English camp hard. Dysentery thinned ranks. By the time Henry marched north in October, his army numbered only around 6,000, mostly longbow men and dismounted knights. The French had mustered a large force, perhaps 20,000 or more, under the Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut. Factional divisions lingered, but the threat of English conquest forced uneasy unity. They shadowed Henry's march, blocking river crossings and forcing a long detour inland. After crossing the Somme at low tide, Henry headed for Calais across muddy fields. Heavy rain soaked the ground. Men and horses grew weary. Food ran short. On October 24, French heralds found the English camp and announced battle the next day. Henry welcomed the challenge. Retreat looked impossible. He chose ground near the village of Agincourt, a narrow strip between two woods, about 1,000 yards wide. Freshly ploughed fields lay soft from rain. Henry positioned his men in a thin line, dismounted knights in the centre, longbowmen on the flanks, and mixed among them. Stakes sharpened from local trees protected the archers. The French arrived late and spent the night in discomfort. Their commanders argued over order of battle. Many great lords insisted on leading the vanguard for honour. Thousands of knights dismounted for the main attack. Others stayed mounted on the wings. Crossbowmen and artillery waited behind. Dawn on October 25. St. Crispin's Day brought mist and drizzle. The armies faced each other across 800 yards. Hours passed. Neither moved. Henry needed victory or safe passage. Waiting favoured the larger French force. Around 11, he advanced his line halfway, within longbow range. Archers drove new stakes and loosed volleys to provoke. The French responded at last. Mounted knights on the wings charged first, hoping to roll up the English flanks. Mud slowed them to a walk. Arrows struck horses and riders alike. Few reached the line. Survivors withdrew. The main attack followed. Dismounted French knights in heavy plate, 3 ranks deep, advancing shoulder to shoulder. The narrow field compressed them further. Mud clung to armour. Each step sank ankle deep. Progress slowed to a crawl. When they closed, English arrows poured in. Bodkin points found gaps in plate. Men fell, tripping those behind. The front rank reached Henry's line exhausted and bunched. Hand-to-hand fighting began. Maces, shortened lances, daggers. English numbers were fewer, but fresh and on firmer ground. The press grew deadly. Fallen knights in heavy armour could not rise. Many suffocated under piling bodies. Rear ranks pushed forward blindly. Panic spread. Some French turned back, colliding with fresh units. Henry's archers, arrows spent, joined the melee with axes and swords. A small French reserve on the flank threatened briefly, but was driven off. Rumours spread that the English baggage was looted. Henry ordered French prisoners killed to free guards, a harsh but common act that stained the victory. By early afternoon the battle ended. French losses stunned the kingdom. Thousands dead, including the constable, many dukes, counts, and barons. Prisoners numbered in the thousands, more great lords captured than killed. English dead totaled a few hundred. The flower of French nobility lay in the mud. Entire families lost heirs. The Armagnac faction suffered worst, weakening their hold on the mad king's court. Henry marched on to Calais, unopposed, then home to triumph. Parliament voted generous funds. He returned in 1417 and 1419, conquering Normandy town by town. Siege warfare replaced big battles. Castles fell steadily. Historians still argue the exact French numbers and whether overconfidence or poor ground decided the day. Most agree terrain and discipline mattered more than raw courage. The narrow front neutralized French numbers. Mud and arrows did the rest. One quirky detail stands out. English longbowmen carried not just arrows but mallets to drive stakes. When ammunition ran low, those same mallets became brutal weapons against armoured foes struggling in the mire. Agincourt restored English momentum lost since Poitiers. Henry's reputation soared, pious, warrior, tactician, king. French morale collapsed further. Burgundians, already alienated, drifted toward separate peace. The victory did not end the war, but reshaped it. Large French field armies became rare. Towns and fortresses decided control. Henry exploited division masterfully, allying with Burgundy and pressing claims. Yet the triumph carried seeds of later trouble. So many French nobles died or were ransomed that rebuilding leadership took years. Surviving lords grew cautious, and England's commitment, strong under Henry, would waver after him. For now, Agincourt echoed Crécy and Poitiers, smaller English army, revolutionary archery, devastating noble losses. The pattern seemed unbreakable. France appeared on the brink again. One more push, many believed, would finish the contest. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 would test that belief and show how fragile even the greatest victory could prove. After Agincourt, Henry V returned to France with steady purpose. From 1417 to 1419, he conquered Normandy piece by piece. Town after town surrendered rather than face siege. Caen fell again, Rouen after 6 months of hunger. By 1419, almost the entire duchy acknowledged English rule. Henry governed it firmly, appointing captains, collecting taxes, rebuilding order. French divisions deepened. The murder of John the Fearless on the bridge at Montereau in September 1419 pushed his son, Philip the Good, into open alliance with England. Burgundy now controlled Paris and held the mad King Charles VI. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited and declared illegitimate by his mother, retreated south of the Loire with Armagnac supporters. Queen Isabeau, long estranged from her son, sided with Burgundy. Negotiations began. Henry demanded full recognition of his claim to the French throne after Charles VI's death, plus Normandy and expanded Aquitaine outright. Burgundy needed English help to secure power. The Dauphin refused any compromise. In May 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed in the cathedral city. The terms were sweeping. Henry married Catherine, daughter of Charles VI. He was named heir to the French crown, bypassing the Dauphin. Charles VI would remain king until his death, but Henry became regent, governing in his place. The kingdoms would stay separate in law but united under one monarch, forever a dual monarchy. The treaty declared the Dauphin a traitor, stripped him of rights, and forbade French subjects from obeying him. Burgundy gained influence at court. Henry promised to recover all lands held by the Dauphin's party. Both sides ratified quickly. In December 1420, Henry entered Paris in triumph with Charles VI and Philip the Good riding beside him. Crowds watched in silence. The mad king seemed unaware of the meaning. For England, Troyes looked like final victory. Henry held northern France, the richest part. Burgundy's lands linked English Normandy to Flemish trade. Gascony remained loyal in the south. The French crown itself waited only for Charles VI's death. Henry moved fast to make it real. He besieged Dauphinist strongholds south of Paris. Melun resisted for months but fell in November 1420. Sens and other towns followed. In 1421, he returned briefly to England to raise more funds and show his new queen. Parliament cheered. Taxes flowed. Back in France, Henry campaigned again. But in the summer of 1422, illness struck, likely dysentery from a siege. He weakened rapidly. On August 31, at Vincennes, Henry V died at 35. His son, Henry VI, was 9 months old. Charles VI followed him 6 weeks later, on October 21. By the treaty, the infant became king of both England and France. Regents ruled in his name: John of Bedford in France, Humphrey of Gloucester in England. Philip of Burgundy stayed allied, holding Paris. Historians still argue whether Troyes could ever have lasted. Many point out that it rested on force and division, not French acceptance. Outside English and Burgundian zones, the treaty meant little. The Dauphin, now calling himself Charles VII, held court at Bourges and kept support in the centre and south. One quirky detail lingers. During the Paris entry, Charles VI reportedly asked who the foreign king beside him was. Courtiers hushed him quickly. The treaty gave England its greatest paper triumph. Maps showed most of France under the dual crown or allied. Bedford proved a capable regent, winning battles and holding ground. Yet the settlement depended on conquest completed and loyalty secured, neither fully achieved. Henry V's death changed everything. A baby could not inspire armies. English commitment would face new tests. Burgundy's alliance could shift, and south of the Loire, a young king waited, dismissed by many but not defeated. Troyes seemed to seal England's win. In truth, it marked the high point before the long reversal began. The Treaty of Troyes left the Dauphin Charles controlling only the centre and south of France. His court sat at Bourges or Chinon, short of money and men. Many nobles doubted his legitimacy. English and Burgundian forces pressed forward. In October 1428, they laid siege to Orléans, the key city on the Loire River. If Orléans fell, the path south lay open. The Dauphin's cause looked finished. Into this despair came a teenage girl from Domremy in Lorraine. Joan, born around 1412, grew up hearing stories of French suffering. From age 13, she reported voices Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret telling her to save France and crown the Dauphin at Reims. She ignored them at first. By 1429, the voices grew urgent. She travelled to nearby Vaucouleurs and convinced a local captain to escort her to the Dauphin. Charles received her skeptically at Chinon in March 1429. Courtiers mocked the peasant girl in rough clothes. Joan spoke privately with the Dauphin, giving details chroniclers later said convinced him of divine support. He sent her to Poitiers for examination by theologians. They questioned her faith and motives, then declared her inspired by God, not the devil. Charles gave her armour, a household, and command of a relief force for Orléans. She rode with the army in May 1429, carrying a white standard painted with the names of Jesus and Mary. Troops already inside the city had held out for 7 months under John of Dunois, the bastard of Orléans. Joan arrived on May 4. She urged immediate attack. French commanders hesitated, preferring caution. On May 7, she joined an assault on the English bastion of Les Tourelles at the southern bridge end. Fighting was fierce along the walls. Joan took an arrow wound to the shoulder but returned after bandaging. As evening fell, French soldiers stormed the fort. The English garrison withdrew overnight. Orléans woke on May 8 to find the siege lifted. Church bells rang. Citizens poured into the streets. The victory felt miraculous after months of failure. One push succeeded with Joan present. Word spread quickly. Morale soared across Dauphinist France. Joan pressed for the next step, crowning Charles at Reims, traditional site for French kings. The direct route lay through Burgundian territory. In June, she led an army north. Towns opened gates rather than fight. At Poitiers on June 18, French cavalry caught English longbowmen unprepared and scattered them. Losses were heavy on the English side. By early July, the army reached Reims. Charles entered the cathedral on the 17th of July, 1429. Joan stood beside him in armour, standard in hand. The coronation restored legitimacy in the eyes of many. Messengers carried news across the kingdom. Joan wanted to march on Paris next. Charles preferred negotiation. A half-hearted attack in September failed. Joan was wounded again. The king ordered retreat. Over winter, momentum slowed. Charles disbanded much of the army to save money. In spring 1430, Joan rode north on her own initiative to relieve Compiègne, besieged by Burgundians. On May 23, during a sortie, she was unhorsed and captured. Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 gold crowns. They handed her to church authorities in Rouen for trial. The trial lasted months. University clerics, mostly pro-English, charged her with heresy, witchcraft, and wearing male clothes. Joan defended herself skillfully, admitting voices but insisting they came from God. Under pressure and threat of torture, she signed a recantation, then revoked it days later. On the 30th of May, 1431, she was burned at the stake in Rouen, aged 19. Historians still argue whether Joan's voices were divine, psychological, or political invention. Most agree her impact was real. She restored belief when France needed it most. Orléans marked the turning point. English advance halted. One quirky detail survives in trial records. Joan insisted her standard had more power than her sword. She never killed anyone personally. Her death did not undo the change. French confidence returned. Charles VII, now properly crowned, began reforms. English regents faced growing resistance. Burgundy wavered in the alliance. Joan shifted the war's psychology. A peasant girl inspired armies where nobles failed. Victories followed her presence. Even enemies feared her name. The siege lifted. The king crowned two achievements that kept the French cause alive. The miracle was brief, but enough. The tide had turned. Joan's execution in 1431 did not end resistance. Charles VII, now firmly crowned, used the renewed confidence to rebuild. He kept court south of the Loire, raising taxes carefully and appointing loyal officials. Money once wasted on factions now paid for a standing army, the first permanent royal force in France. The key reforms came in the 1440s. Charles created the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, mounted companies of professional men-at-arms, paid directly by the crown and housed in garrisons. He also established the Franks archers, local infantry trained and equipped at royal expense. These units answered only to the king, not feudal lords. Discipline improved. Desertion dropped. Artillery changed fastest. Early cannons had been clumsy, more noisy than deadly. French gunsmiths, brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau, designed better bronze pieces, lighter, longer barreled, firing heavier shot accurately. Cast in quantity, they battered stone walls quickly. By mid-century, French siege trains outmatched English ones. Burgundy shifted sides in 1435. The Treaty of Arras reconciled Philip the Good with Charles VII. Burgundy withdrew support from England, gaining trade privileges and territory. English holdings in the north grew isolated. Normandy fell town by town between 1449 and 1450. A swift campaign under Dunois and the Count of Clermont cleared the duchy. Rouen surrendered without a long siege. Gascony proved harder. Local lords had grown used to English rule and lighter taxes. English garrisons held Bordeaux and Bayonne. In 1451, a French army under Dunois marched south. Many towns opened gates, but Bordeaux resisted. English reinforcements under John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, arrived by sea that October. Aged over 70 but still vigorous, Talbot retook the city. Cheers greeted him. Gascons feared French taxation. Charles prepared a larger response for 1453. Two armies converged on the southwest, one from the north, one from the east. Bordeaux was besieged again in June. Talbot marched to relieve it with about 6,000 men, mostly local recruits. French forces under Jean Bureau waited near the village of Castillon on the Dordogne River. On July 17, Talbot reached the area. Scouts reported the French camp lightly defended. He attacked at once, believing the main army away foraging. In truth, over 10,000 French troops held a fortified park, trenches, palisades, and more than 300 cannons in prepared positions. English and Gascon cavalry charged first. French guns opened fire. Shot tore gaps in the ranks. Horses fell. Riders dismounted and pressed on foot. Archers tried to reply, but range and earthworks favoured the artillery. Wave after wave advanced into concentrated fire. Talbot rode forward to rally his men. A cannonball struck his horse. He fell pinned. French soldiers closed in and killed him. His death broke morale. The attack collapsed. Survivors fled toward Bordeaux. French losses were light, perhaps 100. English and Gascon dead numbered thousands. The field lay covered with broken banners and armour. Bordeaux surrendered in October after hearing the news. Bayonne followed soon after. Only Calais remained English on the continent. Castillon ended major fighting. No formal peace treaty marked the close both sides simply stopped. The war that began in 1337 faded in 1453. England, distracted by internal strife that became the Wars of the Roses, could not mount another expedition. Historians still argue whether Castillon was the true final battle or merely the last significant one. Most agree artillery decided the day. Guns had ended the age of charging knights and longbow dominance. One quirky detail lingers. Talbot's body was identified by his false teeth, wired with gold, a rare feature noted by heralds. Charles VII entered the recovered lands quietly. He reduced taxes in Gascony to win loyalty. Royal administration spread. The kingdom, scarred but larger in authority, emerged stronger. Standing armies and effective artillery became the new European standard. The long war was over. France had endured, adapted, and prevailed. The 100 Years' War ended in 1453, with England holding only Calais. Every famous battlefield victory, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, had failed to deliver lasting conquest. The paradox stands clear. England won the battles but lost the war. Tactical brilliance could not overcome deeper realities. France had far greater population and resources. Once Charles V and later Charles VII built steady taxation and professional armies, they outlasted English expeditions. Campaigns across the Channel cost huge sums raised from a smaller island tax base. Parliament grew reluctant to fund endless occupation. Holding distant lands required garrisons England could not sustain long-term. Victories scattered French forces temporarily, but French kings rebuilt quietly, retaking castles through siege and diplomacy. England lacked the manpower for permanent control beyond a few strongholds. Alliances shifted. Burgundy's support evaporated after Arras. Flemish trade pulled England one way, Scottish pressure another. Internal strife, the Wars of the Roses, finally drained commitment. The war forged both nations. France emerged more centralized, with stronger royal authority, standing armies, and effective artillery. The feudal levy faded. Modern state power began. England turned seaward. Losing continental dreams focused energy on trade, exploration, and island defense. National identity sharpened English, replaced French as the language of court and law. Historians still argue whether the war was ultimately English overreach or French resilience. Most agree battles decide days, not centuries. Strategy, logistics, and endurance decide wars. One quirky detail remains. English soldiers brought football to France during truces. Locals adopted the game, a quiet cultural exchange amid the fighting. The long conflict taught a lasting lesson. Brilliance on the field means little without the depth to hold what is won. England learned it the hard way. France endured and prevailed.